Welcome back to the Visions of War podcast, hosted by Emmy Award-winning historian Bob Carruthers. This is military history from primary sources.
I'm honoured to have been making military history documentaries for the past 30 years, and in that time I'm proud to have won an Emmy Award. But more importantly, I've also discovered and shared some great primary source material concerning the history of warfare. My Visions of War podcast is brought to you by Combat War Channel. Combat War Channel is the home of a huge array of informative documentaries covering every aspect of military history. You'll find Combat War Channel wherever you get my podcasts, so please be sure to check out Combat War Channel. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. For this episode, I'm joined by my colleague Emma Bernbach as we revisit the tragic events of August 9th, 1945, the day the atom bomb was detonated over the city of Nagasaki. Thank you for joining me as I present Visions of War. This is the harrowing saga of the events leading up to the fateful decision to unleash the second atomic bomb, which was detonated over the Japanese city of Nagasaki on 9th of August 1945. The bomb dropped over Nagasaki caused death and mutilation of 100,000 Japanese men, women and children. That tragic event took place only 3 days after the first atomic bomb had been detonated over Hiroshima. The heartbreaking fact is that the detonation of the atom bomb over Hiroshima 3 days earlier on 6th of August 1945 constituted an undisputable demonstration that the time had come for Japan's immediate surrender. The evidence from Hiroshima was powerful and conclusive. There was therefore no need for any further proof. The detonation over Nagasaki of the second atomic bomb 3 days later ought therefore to have been avoided. However, as you're about to discover, due to a combination of unfortunate weather events, political procrastination by Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War, and the fanatical Japanese mindset, the dismal fact remains: it took the detonation of a second atom bomb to finally force Japan into surrender. On August 19th, 1945, a US Army film crew recorded the arrival of the Japanese peace envoys. They arrived on Iwo on white-painted Mitsubishi G4M bombers with black crosses. The Japanese war party had finally been defeated. The dream of a Japanese empire was now at an end. More importantly, the nightmare of 15 years of war in China, Asia and the Pacific was over at last.
The successful invasion of the Japanese island of Okinawa, which began on the 1st of April 1945, served a salutary warning to the US High Command. The prefecture of Okinawa was the fifth largest island of Japan. However, Okinawa is a relatively small island. It measures 62 miles long and is only 17 miles wide at its widest point. In the face of dogged Japanese resistance, during the 82-day battle for Okinawa, US ground forces suffered a staggering 50,000 casualties. On June 22nd, when Okinawa was finally considered subdued, the Allies had learned a stark lesson. There appeared to be no alternative but to gather together the mightiest military force ever assembled and prepare for the launch of Operation Downfall, the massive invasion of the Japanese home islands, which was planned to be launched in October 1945.
Building on all of the painful lessons learned from the invasion of Okinawa, Operation Downfall was the code name for the planned Allied invasion of Japan, which was intended to bring about the end of the war in 1946. The projected operation was split into two distinct parts. Operation Olympic was planned for October 1945 and involved a series of landings by the US Sixth Army intended to capture the southernmost third of the main Japanese island, Kyushu. This was to be followed in March 1946 by Operation Coronet, the capture of the Kanto Plain near Tokyo, which is on the main Japanese island of Honshu. The forces earmarked for Operation Coronet were the US 1st, 8th and 10th Armies and a Commonwealth Corps made up of Australian, British and Canadian divisions. The target date of March 1946 for the launch of Operation Coronet was chosen for three reasons: to allow time for Operation Olympic to achieve its objectives, and for troops to be redeployed from Europe, and the end of the Japanese winter in 1946.
In mid-1944, the long-ranged Boeing B-29 Superfortress became ready for use in combat. During 1945, aircraft flying from Allied aircraft carriers and the Ryukyu Islands also regularly struck targets in Japan. In March 1945, a bombing campaign to support the coming Operation Downfall began with an overwhelming wave of low-level incendiary bombing raids against Japanese cities. These raids were purposefully designed to cause firestorms, which would destroy the wooden buildings which formed the bulk of Japanese buildings.
Bombardier, this is radar operator, over.
This is Bombardier, go ahead.
The wind is from 268 degrees at 138 miles per hour. Ground speed on the bomb run, 394 miles per hour.
Data taken from the electronic wonder instruments is converted to precision aiming, pinpoint bombing.
17 degrees right.
Radar operator, this is Bombardier, over.
Go ahead, Bombardier.
The site's set up, we're ready to bomb.
And this is what the Jap sees. His cities, his factories, in ruins.
Firebombing then switched to smaller cities, with populations ranging from 60,000 to 350,000. According to Yuki Tanaka, the US firebombed over 100 Japanese towns and cities. In 1945, firebombing Japanese cities was considered necessary in order to destroy Japanese military production capacity and destroy the logistical support mechanisms which kept Japanese fighting forces supplied with weapons, vehicles, food, ammunition, and fuel. There were three main objectives of the US air offensive against Japan. The first was to completely destroy the enemy's remaining war industries. The second was to kill or disable the civilian employees who manned those industries. The third was to undermine civilian morale in the hope that the Japanese civilian population would prevail upon their leaders to end the war.
The US air offensive against Japan was conducted on an unimaginable scale. It was a brutal campaign in every sense of the word. From March to September 1945, the 21st Bomber Command firebombed 100 Japanese cities.
Each superfort carried well over 7,000 gallons of gas, more than 6,000 rounds of ammunition. With their great load of 500-pound general-purpose bombs and incendiaries, they weighed almost 70 tons apiece. And now, below them is Tokyo. Within a radius of 15 miles of the Imperial Palace live 7 million Japanese, a people we used to think of as small, dainty, polite, concerning themselves only with floral arrangements and rock gardens and the cultivation of silkworms. But it isn't silkworms, and it isn't imperial palaces these men are looking for. In the suburbs of Tokyo is the huge Nakajima aircraft plant. Well, Bud, what are you waiting for?
The bombs which were dropped were the forerunners of the infamous napalm bombs which were used in the Vietnam War. Their sole purpose was to cause a blazing inferno. Many Japanese cities suffered terrible damage from aerial bombings, and some were as much as 97% destroyed. The firebombing of Tokyo, codenamed Operation Meeting House, was the deadliest bombing raid of the war. On the night of 9th of March 1945, 334 American Superfortress bombers attacked Tokyo. 279 of these bombers dropped firebombs into the pre-designated target area, roughly 4 square miles, centred on the old part of Tokyo. On the ground, there was no escape from that hellish inferno. The firestorm completely engulfed the target zone. As a result, 100,000 people were killed, and 16 square miles of the city was totally destroyed. To give a sense of the scale of the catastrophe, it's sobering to realise that over 250,000 buildings were destroyed during that one appalling night. In consequence, the cost to the US AAF was relatively modest. Just 29 B-29 bombers were shot down by flak and by fighters. 94% of the attacking aircraft returned to base. The terrifying results of the Tokyo raid demonstrated the effectiveness of the firebombing. By May, 75% of bombs dropped on Japan were incendiaries. They were designed to burn down what America disdainfully called Japan's paper cities. By mid-June 1945, Japan's 6 largest cities had been utterly devastated. Urban Japan was becoming a wasteland of ash and debris. The Japanese military was unable to stop the Allied attacks, and the country's civil defence preparations proved totally inadequate. From April 1945, the Japanese interceptors also had to face American fighter escorts based on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Between April and June 1945, 72 million litres of very precious aviation fuel had been consumed in the Japanese home islands area. The situation grew so desperate that the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service stopped attempting to intercept the air raids. They did that in order to preserve fighter aircraft to counter the expected invasion of Japan. By limiting air operations, by July 1945, the Japanese High Command had amassed 137 million litres of aviation fuel, which was to be available for the forthcoming defence against the invasion of the Japanese home islands. To help conserve those precious supplies of fuel, by mid-1945, the Japanese only occasionally scrambled aircraft to intercept the individual B-29s, which for them were obviously conducting reconnaissance sorties over the country. Although the Japanese military decided to resume attacks on Allied bombers in late June 1945, by this time there were too few operational fighters available. Nonetheless, Japan was undaunted and continued to resist. For the Allied High Command and its political leadership, there appeared to be no alternative but to prepare for the launch of Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, which was planned to be launched in October 1945.
However, on the 16th of July 1945, a radical solution was presented to the Allied commanders. The first nuclear bomb was successfully tested 200 miles south of Los Alamos. Thanks to the famous Manhattan Project, America had won the race to generate enough uranium-235 to power an atom bomb.
It's essential to realise that by 1939, the principles of nuclear fission were not a secret. They were well known and understood by scientists around the globe. The discovery of nuclear fission by German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in 1938 meant the development of an atomic bomb was now a very real prospect. In consequence, Britain, the USA, Germany and Japan all began work on research programs to develop the atomic bomb. In 1941, Yoshio Nishina, a leading nuclear scientist, was commissioned by the Japanese army to develop an atomic weapon. This project was codenamed NIGO. From 1941 onwards, Nishina was on the path which, given time and a sufficient supply of uranium, would ultimately have produced a Japanese atom bomb. In 1942, the Technical Research Institute of the Imperial Japanese Navy, headed by Captain Yoji Ito, concluded that the US was certainly working on an atomic bomb. In 1942, therefore, the Japanese Navy commenced a rival atomic bomb development project codenamed FGO. This project was under the direction of Bunsaku Arakatsu, a physics professor at Kyoto Imperial University. Arakatsu had studied in Berlin under Albert Einstein. Also involved in the Japanese Navy's FGO nuclear weapons research was Hideki Yukawa, who in 1949 was to become Japan's first Nobel laureate in physics. Although the F project aimed to develop atomic weapons, Yukawa's work was focused on theoretical aspects of nuclear physics, particularly the strong nuclear force. Arakatsu and his FGO laboratory team pursued uranium enrichment with centrifuges. However, the major obstacle for both NIGO and FGO was uranium procurement. Teams of Japanese scientists were sent to scour various parts of Asia, even as far as Mongolia and Burma, but none of them could acquire the requisite supplies of uranium ore. However, Due to the shortage of uranium, the Navy Committee estimated it would take Japan until 1955 to develop its own atomic bomb. Towards the war's end, projects NEGO and FGO were combined. The problem of generating or sourcing enough enriched uranium-235 remained the stumbling block.
In early May 1945, the Interim Committee was created at the urging of the leaders of the Manhattan Project and with the approval of Truman, to advise on matters pertaining to nuclear technology. They agreed that the atomic bomb was to be used against Japan at the earliest opportunity, without special warning and on a dual target of military installations surrounded by other buildings susceptible to damage. During the meetings on the 31st of May and the 1st of June, scientist Ernest Lawrence had suggested giving the Japanese a non-combat demonstration.
Though the possibility of a demonstration that would not destroy human lives was attractive, no one could suggest a way in which it could be made so convincing that it would be likely to stop the war. It was evident that everyone would suspect trickery. If a bomb were exploded in Japan with previous notice, the Japanese air power was still adequate to give serious interference. An atomic bomb was an intricate device, still in the developmental stage. Its operation would be far from routine. If during the final adjustments of the bomb, the Japanese defenders should attack, a faulty move might easily result in some kind of failure. Such an end to an advertised demonstration of power would be much worse than if the attempt had not been made. It was now evident that when the time came for the bombs to be used, we should have only one of them available, followed afterwards by others at all too long intervals. We could not afford the chance that one of them might be a dud. If the test were made on some neutral territory, it was hard to believe that Japan's determined and fanatical military men would be impressed. If such an open test were made first and failed to bring surrender, the chance would be gone to give the shock of surprise that proved so effective. On the contrary, it would make the Japanese ready to interfere with an atomic attack if they could.
The possibility of a demonstration was raised again in the Frank Report, issued by physicist James Frank on the 11th of June, and the Scientific Advisory Panel rejected his report on the 16th of June, saying that we can propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. We see no acceptable alternative to direct military use. Frank then took the report to Washington, D.C., where the Interim Committee met on the 21st of June to re-examine its earlier conclusions. But it reaffirmed that there was no alternative to the use of the bomb on a military target. Like Compton, many US officials and scientists argued that a demonstration would sacrifice the shock value of the atomic attack, and the Japanese could deny the atomic bomb was lethal, making the mission less likely to produce surrender. Allied prisoners of war might be moved to the demonstration site and be killed by the bomb. They also worried that the bomb might be a failure, as the Trinity test was that of a stationary device, not an air-dropped bomb. In addition, although more bombs were in production, only 2 would be available at the start of August, and they cost billions of dollars. So using one for a demonstration would be an expensive waste of time and scarce resources.
The successful test of an atomic bomb took place on the Alamogordo bombing range in the inhospitable desert area known as Jornada del Muerto, or Dead Man's Trail. During the Second World War, producing sufficient plutonium and uranium-235 to power 3 atomic bombs was the major achievement of the highly secretive Manhattan Project. Unbeknown to the Japanese Supreme Council for the Direction of War, the Manhattan Project, in addition to producing enough uranium-235 to power an atom bomb, codenamed Little Boy, they had also mastered the process of producing enough plutonium to power 3 additional nuclear bombs of the type codenamed Fat Man. The Chief of Staff of the US Army immediately prepared for atomic bombs to be used on 4 Japanese cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto. The first of the Fat Man type plutonium bombs was used in the Trinity nuclear test in July 1945. The second was to be detonated over Nagasaki on 9th of August 1945.
In the face of the certain prospect of hundreds of thousands of American casualties, which would be incurred in the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, events moved at lightning speed. The consent of the United Kingdom was obtained for the bombing, as was required by the Quebec Agreement, and orders were issued on the 25th of July by General Thomas T. Handy, the acting Chief of Staff of the US Army, for atomic bombs to be used on Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. These targets were chosen because they were large urban areas that also held significant military facilities. The 509th Composite Group of the US Army Air Forces was trained and equipped with the specialised silver plate version of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress and deployed to Tinian in the Mariana Islands.
By rejecting the idea of unconditional surrender, the Japanese High Command had made a fatal error, which was to cost the lives of 100,000 civilians. The important factor, and that of overriding importance, was the fact that by July 1945, the Manhattan Project had actually succeeded in producing not just 1, but 2 types of atomic bomb. Little Boy, which was exploded above Hiroshima on 6th of August 1945, was the world's one and only atomic bomb powered by enriched uranium. However, unknown to the Japanese Supreme Council for the Direction of War was the fact that also in readiness was the Fat Man, a plutonium implosion type nuclear weapon. It was this type of atom bomb which had been tested by a controlled ground-based explosion 210 miles south of Los Alamos on 16th of July. The 2 atom bombs which are ready to be dropped from aircraft over Japan were the very first of their kind. They were in effect experimental weapons, and there was no guarantee that the bombs dropped from an aircraft, as opposed to a controlled ground explosion, would even work.
As there was no indication of Japan surrendering, on the 6th of August 1945, the United States detonated the first atomic bomb. The target was the city of Hiroshima.
It's vitally important to realise the uranium-235 atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima was the first time such a weapon had been even detonated. Furthermore, it was dropped from an aircraft with a time-delayed fuse. There had been no rehearsal. There was only enough uranium-235 for 1 bomb of the Little Boy type. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was the one and only uranium-powered bomb in the world. This immensely scarce resource was only produced in tiny quantities, and there had been no possibility, therefore, of a test. However, American officials correctly surmised that it would be necessary to drop more than one atom bomb. They appropriately forecast that the Japanese hardliners would minimise the effect of the first explosion and might attempt to explain it away as some sort of abnormal catastrophe. This is precisely what Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War in fact did. In the days following the bombing of Hiroshima, despite all the evidence to the contrary, the Japanese Minister of War refused to even admit that the Hiroshima bomb was indeed an atomic bomb.
In order to maximise the destructive power of the blast, the bomb was detonated 600 yards above the doomed city. The terrifying suffering unleashed by the atom bomb was far beyond anything experienced by the stoic Japanese population, which was already enduring horrific firebombing of 64 Japanese cities, which had ravaged the Japanese home islands.
It's very important to remember that in order to avoid a military conflict with the Soviet Union during the Second World War, Japan relied upon the Non-Aggression Pact signed between Japan and the Soviet Union in 1941. On 25th of July 1945, the US, Great Britain and China issued the Potsdam Declaration demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan. It's important to realise that although the Soviet Union was not a party to the Potsdam Declaration, the warning signs that Stalin was about to attack Japan were already there. This was evident from every newsreel and newspaper report emanating from the assembled press corps at Potsdam. Although Stalin had not yet declared war on Japan and the Soviet Union did not sign the Potsdam Declaration, Stalin was a very high-profile delegate. He was present at the conference and he was clearly in accord with the Allies. Unbeknown to the Japanese, Stalin was more than just an observer. He had agreed a clandestine accord to declare war upon Japan by the 8th of August 1945.
On the 7th of August, a day after Hiroshima was destroyed, Yoshio Nishina, at the head of Project Nigu, Japan's equivalent of the Manhattan Project, arrived at the city. He was met with a nightmarish scene of utter devastation. Nishina returned to Tokyo and told the cabinet that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a nuclear weapon. However, on the advice of Nishina, Admiral Toyoda, the chief of the Naval General Staff, correctly concluded that the extreme difficulty posed by creating enough fissionable uranium-235 meant that in his estimation only one additional atomic bomb could exist at that point in time. In the light of this knowledge, Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War took the crass decision to continue the war.
Stalin's blitzkrieg on 8th of August piled pressure on Japan to surrender unconditionally. This mounted when the Soviet Union declared war against Japan. The Soviet forces immediately invaded the Japanese puppet state in Manchuria. In August 1945, having played its part in the downfall of Nazi Germany, the Red Army was at its peak of efficiency and strength. This lightning blitzkrieg-style attack made huge gains. However, even in the wake of the Soviet declaration of war, there was still no immediate indication of Japan surrendering. However, in order to give time for the seriousness of the situation to sink in on Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War, the Allies decided to delay the dropping of a second atomic bomb until 11th of August 1945.
Scholars have extensively studied the effects of the bombings on the social and political character of subsequent world history and popular culture. There is still much debate concerning the ethical and legal justification for the bombings. According to supporters, the atomic bombings were necessary to bring an end to the war with minimal casualties and ultimately prevented a greater loss of life on both sides. According to the critics, the bombings were unnecessary for the war's end and were a war crime, raising moral and ethical implications.
It's a debate which will never be resolved. There are those who cogently argue that the atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were violations of the laws and customs of war because the attacks did not distinguish between military and civilian targets and inflicted unnecessary suffering by the deliberate bombing of civilians. This constituted a war crime. However, their opponents point to the fact that the Japanese government had promulgated a national mobilization law and were waging total war, which compelled all civilians, including women and children and old people, to work in factories and other infrastructure attached to the war effort and to fight to the death against any invading force. There is also the question of why the dropping of the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki came only 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, when the devastation of Hiroshima had yet to be fully comprehended by the Japanese Supreme Council for the Direction of War. The lack of time between the bombings has led some historians to state that the second bombing was certainly unnecessary, gratuitous at best, and genocidal at worst. However, this argument relies entirely on the benefit of hindsight. The importance of the fact that during the Second World War, Japan had its own atomic bomb development programs cannot be underestimated. In retrospect, we know the Japanese NEGO project was unsuccessful, but in 1945 there was no way of knowing that. Well, that concludes this episode. Thank you for taking the time to join me. Please be sure to check out Combat War Channel, where you'll find so many interesting military history documentaries, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for being with me.